It was a warm, sunny afternoon in the heart of a bustling city when something completely unexpected began to unfold. The streets buzzed with activity, pedestrians hustling, cars honking, and the faint hum of life carrying on as usual. But within the chaos of everyday life, a moment of tension was brewing that no one could have predicted. It all started at a routine traffic stop, the kind most people forget about by the end of the day. But this time, it would be anything but ordinary. Officer Daniels, a seasoned cop with a reputation for being unyielding, prided himself on his authority. He walked with a sense of purpose, his badge gleaming in the sunlight, and carried himself as though the law began and ended with him. He had seen it all. Also, he thought, Daniels was known for being strict, sometimes even too strict, but in his mind, that was what kept the streets in order. He believed in power hierarchy and, most importantly, that his authority should never be questioned. On the other hand, there was Judge Olivia Carter, a respected figure in the legal world. She was sharp, fair, and unwavering in her commitment to justice. Her rise to the bench was a testament to her resilience, intelligence, and dedication to upholding the law. Judge Carter wasn't just any judge. She was one of the most respected in the state. Her presence commanded respect, and her decisions were rarely challenged. But beneath her calm and composed demeanor was a woman who had faced countless battles to reach where she was today. Battles fought not just in the courtroom, but in a society where her every move was scrutinized simply because of who she was. Their paths were destined to cross in a way that would shake the foundations of their beliefs and leave everyone watching stunned. It began when Judge Carter was pulled over by Officer Daniels. She had just finished a long day at court and was on her way home, her mind preoccupied with thoughts of the cases she had presided over. The flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror were unexpected, but she calmly pulled over, confident there was some misunderstanding. Daniels approached the car with his usual authoritative stride, his hand resting on his belt. He didn't recognize her. How could he? In his mind, she was just another driver who had broken the law. And Daniels wasn't one to show leniency, not even for a second. License and registration, he said curtly, his tone carrying a sharp edge. Judge Carter handed over her documents without hesitation, her expression calm but firm. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady. Daniels glanced at the documents but didn't really take them in. His focus was on a certain control over the situation. "You were speeding," he said bluntly, his eyes narrowing as though daring her to argue. "I see," she replied simply. There was no panic, no defensiveness, just a quiet confidence that seemed to irritate Daniels even more. Her calm demeanor only fueled his determination to establish dominance. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Judge Carter hesitated for a moment, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. This was unnecessary, and she knew it. But she also knew better than to escalate the situation. Quietly, she opened the door and stepped out, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. As Daniels began to question her, his tone grew sharper, more condescending. It was as though he couldn't fathom someone like her. A poised, articulate black woman, challenging his authority. What he didn't realize was that he wasn't just dealing with anyone. He was dealing with someone who upheld the very laws he was supposed to enforce. The tension between them crackled in the air like static electricity, drawing the attention of a few passers-by who began to linger, sensing that something unusual was happening. Judge Carter remained calm, her expression unreadable, while Daniels seemed to grow increasingly agitated. And then it happened. She calmly but firmly said, "Officer, I'm Judge Olivia Carter." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, silencing everything around them. Daniels froze for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. But instead of backing down or apologizing, he doubled down, his pride refusing to let him admit he might have made a mistake. "I don't care who you are," he snapped, his voice laced with irritation. "Right now, you're just another citizen breaking the law." Judge Carter's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke volumes, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Daniel's face. What happened next would leave everyone, including the growing crowd, absolutely speechless. A moment of reckoning was about to unfold, one that would challenge not only Officer Daniel's authority, but also his very perception of justice, respect, and humanity. And as the scene unfolded, the question lingered. What happens when an immovable force meets an unshakable will? The answer was about to be revealed, and it was something no one could have anticipated. Officer Daniels stood there, his jaw tight, trying to process what Judge Olivia Carter had just said. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but his pride refused to let him falter. He had dealt with all kinds of people before, business executives, lawyers, even a few celebrities, but this felt different. Something about her calm confidence unnerved him, as if she wasn't afraid of him or his authority, and that made him want to push harder. The small crowd that had gathered nearby grew more curious. They whispered among themselves, wondering why this woman, so composed and poised, seemed unfazed by the officer's growing frustration. A few pulled out their phones, discreetly recording the exchange, sensing that something significant was happening. Daniels glanced at the papers in his hand, his mind racing. He could see her name now, printed clearly, Olivia Carter, but he still wasn't ready to connect the dots. To him, she was just another citizen trying to pull rank, to avoid accountability. He wasn't about to let that happen. Judge or not, Daniels said, his tone sharp, you're still subject to the law, like everyone else. So, unless you've got some magical badge that lets you speed without consequences, you're not above this. Olivia Carter didn't flinch. Her steady gaze met his, and for a brief moment it felt as though she could see right through him. Officer Daniels, she began, her voice calm but firm, I'm well aware of the law. In fact, I spent my entire career upholding it. But I'd advise you to think carefully about how you proceed from here. Daniels felt a flicker of doubt, but he quickly buried it beneath his growing frustration. Is that a threat? He shot back, his voice rising slightly. It's advice, Olivia replied evenly, her tone unwavering. One that could save us both a great deal of unnecessary trouble. Daniels felt his grip tighten around the ticket pad in his hand. This wasn't going the way he had anticipated. He was used to people backing down, apologizing, scrambling to avoid further conflict. But she wasn't doing any of that. Instead, she stood there, calm and composed, as though she already knew how this would end. The tension between them was palpable, and the crowd grew larger, their murmurs growing louder. Someone in the back called out, Hey, leave her alone. She hasn't done anything wrong. Daniels whipped his head around, glaring in the direction of the voice, but he couldn't pinpoint who had spoken. He turned back to Olivia, determined to regain control of the situation. Ma'am, he said, forcing his tone to remain professional, I'm going to need you to cooperate fully, if you continue to make this difficult. Difficult. Olivia interrupted, her voice calm, but carrying a sharp edge now. Officer Daniels, I have done nothing but cooperate. But I suggest you take a moment to reflect on whether your actions right now are in line with your duty to serve and protect. Her words landed like a hammer, and for the first time, Daniels felt the crowd's eyes shift from curiosity to something heavier. Judgment. The pressure was building, and he could feel it. But Daniels wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. He was determined to prove he was in control, that his authority wasn't something to be questioned or undermined. He cleared his throat and said, Judge Carter, if you feel this is inappropriate, you're welcome to file a complaint. Until then, I'm handling this by the book. By the book, Olivia repeated, her voice measured but pointed. Good, because when this situation is reviewed, the record will speak for itself. That statement hung in the air, and Daniels felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know what she meant exactly, but the certainty in her tone was unsettling. As the exchange continued, the crowd started recording more openly, their phones aimed directly at the scene. Olivia noticed, but didn't acknowledge them. She wasn't performing for an audience, she was standing her ground because it was the right thing to do. Daniels, however, was all too aware of the eyes on him. The cameras made him uncomfortable, but he couldn't show it. He was supposed to be the one in charge here. He couldn't let this escalate further, or worse, let it slip out of his control entirely. "Step over here, please," Daniels said, motioning toward the curb. His voice carried a note of irritation now, his patience clearly wearing thin. Olivia complied. Walking to the spot he indicated, her every movement deliberate and composed. She wasn't intimidated, and that only added to the weight of the moment. Daniels started jotting something down on his ticket pad, his hand moving quickly, as though the act of writing could somehow reassert his authority. He glanced up at her every few seconds, but her expression never wavered. "What's your badge number, Officer Daniels?" Olivia asked suddenly, her voice breaking through the quiet hum of the crowd. Daniels froze for a split second before answering. "It's right here," he said, pointing to the badge pinned to his chest. "I'll need you to say it out loud for the record," Olivia replied, her tone polite but firm. For the first time, Daniels hesitated. He looked around, feeling the weight of the crowd's gaze and the phone still recording. Slowly, he recited his badge number, his voice tight. "Thank you," Olivia said, her tone neutral. "I'll be including that in my report." Daniels felt his pulse quicken. "Report?" he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "What report?" "The one I'll be filing with your department," Olivia said simply, her words carrying an air of finality. "As a public servant, I trust you understand the importance of accountability." The crowd murmured again, their voices a mix of curiosity and approval. Daniel's face flushed, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his features. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, a voice crackled over his radio. "Daniels, status update. Do you need backup?" The sudden interruption made him jump slightly. He fumbled for his radio, his movements hurried. "No backup needed," he said quickly, his voice uneven. Olivia watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to say anything else. The balance of power had shifted, and it was clear that Daniels felt it. But even as the tension hung thick in the air, the situation remained unresolved. The crowd stayed, their cameras rolling, waiting to see how this would end. Daniels knew he had a choice to make, but his pride and anger kept him rooted in place, unwilling to admit he might have been wrong. And so the moment lingered, the weight of the unresolved conflict pressing down on everyone present. What happened next would determine not only the outcome of this tense encounter, but also the lessons that each person involved would carry forward. The moment felt endless, the air so thick with tension that even the usual city noises seemed muted. Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the crowd's stares and the relentless recording of their phones. His radio crackled again, but this time he ignored it, unwilling to let anyone else intervene. He felt trapped in a battle of wills with Judge Olivia Carter, and backing down wasn't an option, at least not yet. Olivia stood silently, her gaze steady, her calm demeanor unwavering despite the charged atmosphere. She wasn't trying to humiliate him, but she also wasn't about to let herself be mistreated. For her, this wasn't just about a traffic stop. It was about principles, about ensuring that even those in positions of authority were held accountable for their actions. She had seen too many cases in her courtroom where unchecked power led to disastrous consequences, and she wasn't about to let this moment pass without standing her ground. The crowd continued to grow, the murmurs among them getting louder. Some were frustrated by the delay, others intrigued by the unfolding drama. A young woman in the front leaned over to whisper to her friend, "She's a judge. No wonder she's so calm." The friend nodded, eyes wide, her phone pointed directly at Daniels. Daniels felt his control slipping with every second that passed. He hated the feeling of being scrutinized, of being second-guessed. It wasn't supposed to go like this. He was supposed to give her a ticket, hear a half-hearted apology, and move on with his day. Instead, he'd found himself locked in a battle he didn't fully understand. "Ma'am," Daniels said, his voice clipped, "if you have any complaints about how this is being handled, you can take them up with my supervisor. Right now, I need you to stop interfering and let me do my job." "I'm not interfering, Officer Daniels," Olivia replied, her tone as steady as ever. I'm simply holding you to the same standard you hold others to. That's fair, isn't it? Daniels clenched his jaw, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. Fair, he repeated, almost to himself, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. Meanwhile, in the growing crowd, a man in a suit stepped forward. He had been standing quietly for a while, observing the scene with a sharp eye. His name was Marcus Taylor, a local attorney who often worked with Olivia in court. He recognized her immediately and felt a mix of anger and disbelief at what was unfolding. "Officer Daniels," Marcus said, stepping closer but keeping his hands visible. "I think you're dealing with a bit of a misunderstanding here." Daniels turned sharply toward him, his expression hardening. "Sir, I need you to step back and stay out of this. This doesn't concern you." Marcus raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not trying to interfere, but I know Judge Carter, and I can assure you she's not the type of person to cause trouble. Maybe if you took a moment to listen." "I don't need your input," Daniels snapped, cutting him off. His voice was louder now, drawing more attention. "This is a routine traffic stop, and I'll handle it as I see fit." Marcus took a step back, his expression skeptical but calm. "Of course, officer. Just remember that everyone here is watching." He glanced meaningfully at the crowd before stepping back into it, his phone now in his hand. Daniel's frustration was now mixed with unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that this situation was spiraling out of his control, and it was making him reckless. "Judge Carter," he said, turning back to her, "I'm going to write you a citation for speeding. If you contest it, you can take it to court, like anyone else. This doesn't need to be more complicated than that." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "And what speed are you alleging I was driving at, officer?" Daniels hesitated for a fraction of a second. He hadn't clocked her speed on his radar. Head made the stop based on an assumption, and now he realized he hadn't even checked to confirm it. But he couldn't admit that, not now, not in front of all these people. "You were going at least 10 miles over the limit," he said, his voice firm, but lacking conviction. "At least 10. Olivia repeated, her tone calm but questioning. "That doesn't sound very precise for an officer who claims to follow the book." The crowd murmured again, some chuckling quietly, others shaking their heads. Daniel's face flushed red, but he refused to back down. "Ma'am, I don't need to debate this with you," he said, his tone sharper now. "You were speeding, and that's the end of it." Olivia tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "If that's the case, I'd like to see the evidence. Do you have radar documentation or any other proof to substantiate your claim?" Daniels froze. He could feel the weight of her question pressing down on him, and he realized he had no good answer. The crowd seemed to sense it too, their murmurs growing louder. At that moment, a patrol car pulled up to the scene, its lights flashing but its siren silent. A senior officer stepped out, his presence commanding immediate attention. His name was Lieutenant Harris, and he had a reputation for being both fair and no-nonsense. "What's going on here?" Harris asked, his voice calm but firm. His eyes scanned the crowd before landing on Daniels and Olivia. Daniels straightened immediately, his hand gripping his ticket pad tightly. "Lieutenant, I've got it under control. It's just a routine traffic stop." Harris raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "It doesn't look routine to me. Why don't you step aside and let me handle this?" Daniels hesitated, his pride battling with his common sense. Finally, he nodded and took a step back, his jaw clenched. Harris turned to Olivia, his expression softening. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Harris. Can you tell me what's going on here?" Olivia met his gaze, her expression calm but serious. "Lieutenant Harris, I was pulled over by Officer Daniels, who claims I was speeding. I've asked for evidence to support his claim, but he has yet to provide any." Harris nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I see. Let me take a look at the situation, and we'll sort this out." As Harris began to review the details, the tension lingered in the air. The crowd watched closely, their cameras still recording, their curiosity unbroken. Daniels stood off to the side, his expression unreadable, but his mind racing. He felt the walls closing in, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. And as the scene continued to unfold, one question loomed large in everyone's mind. How far would Officer Daniels go to protect his pride, and at what cost? Lieutenant Harris stood at the center of the scene, his presence commanding attention. The crowd had grown quieter now, sensing that things were coming to a head. Phones stayed pointed at the officers and Judge Olivia Carter, their cameras capturing every word, every movement. The tension was palpable, the kind that made even the bystanders hold their breath. Harris turned toward Officer Daniels, his voice calm but firm. "Daniels, let's take a step back. Walk me through why you pulled her over." Daniels hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His grip on the ticket pad tightened as he struggled to keep his composure. "She was speeding, sir," he said, his voice clipped. Harris raised an eyebrow. "Speeding? Did you clock her on radar?" Daniels paused, his throat dry. "No, sir," he admitted reluctantly. "I officially estimated her speed." "Visual estimation," Harris repeated, his tone neutral but probing. "And you're sure it was accurate?" "Yes, sir," Daniels said quickly, though there was a tremor of uncertainty in his voice. Harris nodded slowly, considering his response. Then he turned back to Olivia. "Judge Carter, do you have anything to add to this?" Olivia's expression remained composed, though there was a flicker of frustration in her eyes. "Lieutenant, I respect law enforcement and the role you play in keeping our community safe. But Officer Daniels' actions today have been anything but professional. He has no evidence to support his claim, and yet he's treated me as though I'm guilty of a crime." Harris glanced at Daniels, who looked away, his jaw tightening. The senior officer's gaze lingered on him for a moment before returning to Olivia. "I understand your concerns, ma'am. Let me assure you, we're going to handle this fairly." The crowd murmured again, their voices rising as the drama intensified. Some whispered about Daniels' demeanor, others speculated on what Harris might do next. The air felt electric, every second stretching into an eternity. Daniels, feeling the pressure mounting, suddenly stepped forward. "Lieutenant, with all due respect, I don't think this is necessary," he said, his voice edged with frustration. "I was just doing my job." Harris turned to him, his expression stern. "Daniels, your job is to enforce the law fairly and professionally. If there's no evidence to support your claim, we have a problem." Daniels' face flushed red. "Are we just going to take her word for it? She's playing the judge card, trying to intimidate me." The crowd gasped audibly at his words, and Harris' expression darkened. "Enough, Daniels," he said sharply. "This isn't about her title. It's about whether or not you handled this stop appropriately." For a moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance. Daniels stood rigid, his fists clenched at his sides, while Olivia remained calm, her confidence unshaken. Harris' gaze moved between them, his mind clearly working through how to defuse the situation. Then, as if on cue, Marcus Taylor, the attorney, stepped forward again. "Lieutenant Harris," he said, his tone polite but firm, "I've been recording this entire exchange. If you'd like to review the footage, it clearly shows Officer Daniels' behavior from the moment he stopped Judge Carter." Daniels spun toward Marcus, his eyes wide with anger. "You don't have the right to interfere in this," he snapped. "I'm not interfering," Marcus replied coolly. "I'm ensuring that justice is served." Harris held up a hand, silencing them both. "Let me see the footage," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Marcus handed over his phone, and Harris began to watch the video. The crowd shifted nervously, their whispers growing louder as they tried to read the lieutenant's expression. Daniels stood frozen, his face pale, as Harris' eyes narrowed while reviewing the recording. When Harris finished, he handed the phone back to Marcus and turned to Daniels. "Daniels," he said, his voice low but firm, "we need to have a serious conversation." Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but Harris cut him off. "Not here," he said, dancing the crowd. "Step over to the patrol car." The murmurs grew louder as Daniels reluctantly walked away, his shoulders tense, his face a mixture of anger and humiliation. Harris followed, leaving Olivia standing alone for the first time since the encounter began. The crowd shifted its attention to her now, their faces filled with admiration and curiosity. Some clapped quietly, while others approached to offer words of support. But Olivia barely acknowledged them. Her focus remained on the patrol car, where Harris and Daniels were now engaged in a heated but hushed conversation. She couldn't hear the words, but she could see the tension in their body language, the way Daniels gestured wildly, while Harris remained calm and resolute. The scene felt surreal, like a moment suspended in time. Everyone was waiting, holding their breath, wondering what the outcome would be. Daniel's pride and Harris' authority had collided, and the resolution would determine more than just the fate of this traffic stop. It would reveal whether accountability truly existed in a system where power often went unchecked, and whether one man's arrogance could be tempered by the weight of justice. The tension near the patrol car grew thicker as Lieutenant Harris and Officer Daniels continued their conversation. From a distance, the crowd could see Daniels' animated gestures and Harris' calm but firm demeanor. Judge Olivia Carter watched closely, her calm exterior masking a rising concern. While she had stood her ground with dignity, there was still an air of uncertainty about what would come next. The murmurs in the crowd began to change as more people speculated. Whispers of "will Daniels be reprimanded?" and "what if they let him off the hook?" swirled through the air. The uncertainty was almost as unbearable as the confrontation itself. Marcus Taylor, standing nearby, kept a close eye on the scene, his phone still in hand. Then, as Harris and Daniels appeared to be wrapping up their exchange, the unexpected happened. Another car pulled up, unmarked but clearly official. A man in a suit stepped out, his presence radiating authority. He looked around briefly before making his way toward Harris and Daniels. The badge clipped to his belt identified him as someone from Internal Affairs. The crowd immediately picked up on the new arrival, their excitement and curiosity surging. This development wasn't just about one officer anymore. Something larger was brewing, and everyone could feel it. Harris straightened as the man approached, his face unreadable, but his posture slightly stiff. Daniels, on the other hand, looked visibly uneasy, his earlier bravado slipping. The man introduced himself as Agent Richardson, his tone cool and professional. "Lieutenant Harris," Richardson said, extending a hand. "I was in the area when I received a call about this incident. Mind if I take a closer look?" Harris hesitated for a brief moment before nodding. "Of course, Agent Richardson. We're still in the process of sorting things out." Richardson nodded, his gaze briefly flicking to Daniels, who avoided eye contact. "I'll review everything," he said, his tone carrying a weight of finality. "But I'd like to start by speaking with Judge Carter." The crowd gasped softly, their attention shifting back to Olivia. She straightened slightly, her composure intact despite the surprise development. Richardson approached her with a respectful nod. "Judge Carter," he began, "I understand you've had an encounter with Officer Daniels. I'd like to hear your account directly." Olivia's voice was steady as she recounted the events, providing clear details without embellishment. She spoke of how Daniels had pulled her over without clear evidence, how he had escalated the situation unnecessarily, and how his demeanor had been confrontational from the start. Richardson listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes in a small notebook. As Olivia spoke, Daniels shifted uncomfortably near the patrol car, his frustration barely concealed. Harris stood nearby, watching silently, his expression unreadable. When Olivia finished, Richardson nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Judge Carter. That was very helpful." He turned to Marcus. "I understand you recorded some of this interaction. Would you mind sharing the footage with me?" Marcus handed over his phone without hesitation. Richardson watched the video carefully, his expression remaining neutral as the crowd waited with bated breath. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, the weight of the moment almost suffocating. When Richardson finished watching, he handed the phone back to Marcus and turned to face the crowd. His voice was calm, but carried a certain gravity. "Thank you all for your patience. I assure you, this matter is being taken very seriously." Then, addressing Harris and Daniels, he said, "Lieutenant Officer, I'll need to speak with both of you back at the station. This situation requires further review." Daniel's face turned pale, his jaw tightening as he realized the implications. He opened his mouth to protest but stopped himself, the weight of Richardson's authority silencing him. But just as Richardson began to step away, another twist emerged. A man from the crowd called out, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Excuse me, I've seen that officer before." All eyes turned toward the man, who stepped forward hesitantly. He was middle-aged, dressed in casual clothes, and his face was filled with both hesitation and determination. "That's the same cop who pulled me over last month for no reason. He treated me the same way, aggressive, no evidence, just accusations." The crowd buzzed with whispers, the energy shifting again. Richardson turned sharply to face the man, his expression intrigued but cautious. "Sir, are you willing to make a formal statement about your experience?" The man nodded. "Yes. I didn't think anyone would believe me back then. But now—" He gestured toward the scene around him. "Now I see it wasn't just me." Daniel's face turned red, his frustration boiling over. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "You can't just take random accusations like this seriously." Richardson turned to him, his calm demeanor now icy. "Officer Daniels, I suggest you remain quiet until we've had a chance to review everything. Your behavior here is already under scrutiny." The crowd erupted into murmurs again, the tension rising to a fever pitch. It was no longer just about Olivia's traffic stop. Daniel's entire conduct as an officer was being called into question, and the stakes had just been raised dramatically. Olivia exchanged a glance with Marcus, both of them realizing that this had become something much bigger than either of them anticipated. The conflict wasn't just about a single moment of misconduct. It was about systemic accountability, about ensuring that power was wielded responsibly. And as the crowd watched, their phones still recording, it was clear that everyone was waiting for the next move, the next revelation, the next twist in this unfolding drama. As Agent Richardson led Lieutenant Harris and Officer Daniels toward the patrol car, the crowd's energy shifted from murmurs to an almost eerie silence. All eyes were on the trio, and the weight of expectation was palpable. Judge Olivia Carter stood with her arms crossed, watching intently, while Marcus Taylor lingered close by, his phone still at the ready. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the truth, the accountability, the justice they all hoped to see. Richardson stopped short of the patrol car and turned to Harris. "Lieutenant, I'll need a full statement from you as well," he said firmly. Harris nodded, his usual composed demeanor cracking just slightly under the pressure. Daniels, however, was far from composed. His face was flushed, and he fidgeted with his hands, glancing nervously at the crowd that still recorded every second of the unfolding drama. "Daniels," Richardson said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the tension, "you need to understand the severity of what's happening here. This isn't just about a single traffic stop anymore. It's about your pattern of behavior." He gestured toward the man from the crowd who had stepped forward earlier. "When multiple complaints start surfacing, it becomes clear this isn't an isolated incident." Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked like he might argue. But then, almost as if he realized there was no way out, his shoulders slumped. "I was just doing my job," he mumbled, though the conviction in his voice was gone. Richardson turned to the man in the crowd. "Sir, I appreciate your courage in coming forward. If you're willing to file an official complaint, it will strengthen this investigation." The man nodded firmly, stepping closer to Richardson as the crowd began to murmur again, their energy a mix of satisfaction and anticipation. And then, just as the situation seemed to be resolving, the unexpected happened. A woman's voice rang out from the edge of the crowd. "Wait, I have something to add." Heads turned as a young woman pushed her way through. She was holding a folder, her face a mixture of determination and unease. "Who are you?" Richardson asked, his tone cautious but open. "My name is Elena," she said, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength as she continued. "I used to work in the administrative department of the precinct. I left last year because I couldn't stand what I saw happening. Officer Daniels has a history of falsifying reports. I tried to bring it up, but no one listened. She held up the folder. I kept copies of the reports he altered. I thought they might come in handy one day. The crowd erupted into shocked murmurs, the weight of Elena's words hanging heavy in the air. Daniel's face turned ghostly pale, and he took a step back, his mouth opening and closing, as though searching for defense but finding none. Harris looked visibly shaken, glancing between Daniels and Elena as though trying to piece everything together. Richardson stepped forward, taking the folder from Elena. He flipped through the pages quickly, his face growing grimmer with each passing second. "This is serious," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "If these documents are authentic, they confirm a pattern of misconduct that goes beyond anything we initially suspected." Daniels seemed to shrink under the weight of Richardson's words, his bravado completely gone. "I didn't mean to," he started, but Richardson cut him off with a sharp glare. "Save it," Richardson said. "Anything you say now can and will be used against you in the formal investigation." The crowd watched in stunned silence as Richardson turned to Harris. "Lieutenant, I'm taking Officer Daniels into custody for further questioning. We'll need to conduct a full audit of his cases and his conduct on the job." Harris nodded slowly, his face a mix of relief and resignation. "Understood," he said quietly. As Daniels was escorted to the patrol car, the crowd began to cheer softly, their applause growing louder as the realization set in that justice was finally being served. Olivia watched the scene unfold, her expression a mix of satisfaction and thoughtfulness. She had come into this situation as a victim of abuse of power, but now she had witnessed the beginning of a broader reckoning. Just as the patrol car began to pull away with Daniels inside, Richardson turned to the crowd. "This isn't just about one officer," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "It's about ensuring that the system holds everyone accountable, no matter their rank or position." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the street. Marcus turned to Olivia, a small smile on his face. "Well, Judge Carter," he said, "it looks like your persistence paid off." Olivia nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. "It's not about me," she said. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through this." But just as the crowd began to disperse, feeling that justice had been served, Richardson's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his face darkening. He stepped away to take the call, his voice low but tense. Olivia caught a snippet of the conversation as she walked past him. "What do you mean there's more? How many officers are involved?" Her steps faltered, and she turned to look back at Richardson. His expression was grim, his hand gripping the phone tightly. The crowd might have thought this was the end of the story, but Olivia realized it was only the beginning of something much larger. A chill ran down her spine as she walked away, knowing the fight for justice was far from over.